Marco Silva has looked to be the most dominant player of Regulation H, getting a top 16 finish in Lille, second place at Gdansk, and winning LAIC, defending his title and getting his third international win. And incredibly, Marco used the same team at Gdansk and LAIC, demolishing the competition even when his team was a well-known quantity, telling the world he's not afraid of what they can throw at him. However, there is one thing Marco does fear.
Wolfe, compadres.
Wolfe Glick is the most decorated player in VGC and debatably the GOAT of the game. Wolfe has won every single time he's brought Perish Trap to a major event, making the combo perhaps the scariest thing to face in a match. And face this combo is exactly what Marco did, as both he and Wolfe made last-minute decisions to attend the Toronto 2025 Regional Championship, the last event of Regulation H. And walking into the 8th and final round of the day, Marco and Wolfe pair into each other, giving us an appetizer to the match that they would then again play in the finals of this tournament. So starting here, let's take some time to break down their teams, their matchup, and their Swiss set in order to prepare us for that finals match. Marco's team is a Sun team, based around overwhelming the opponent with powerful attacking moves while supporting them with boosting modifiers, speed control, redirection, and sleep powder. Charizard, Ursaluna, and sometimes Torkoal serve as the team's primary offensive threats, with huge damage amplifiers coming from Choice Specs, Solar Power, Guts, and of course, Sun. Looking towards the other ends of Marco's team, we can see Jumpluff, Porygon 2, Incineroar, and again sometimes Torkoal serve more supporting roles, offering speed control options through Tailwind and Trick Room, redirection support through Rage Powder, damage mitigation through most of Incineroar's kit, and last but certainly not least, disruption through Jumpluff's Sleep Powder. It's also worth noting P2, Incineroar, and Ursaluna offer the team substantial bulk, with P2 and Incineroar being great pieces for absorbing damage, while Marco looks to transition his boards to more positive states. Next, let's take a look at Wolfe's team. His team is based around two major modes, Rain and Perish Trap. Politoed is obviously the backbone of the Rain, as it provides the rain. But the main enabler and the star of the Rain core is Kingdra, using Swift Swim to get a speed advantage while relying on Life Orb, Rain, and Terra Stellar as the multipliers that lead to ridiculous amounts of damage. Archaladon is also a member of this Rain mode, with Rain enabling it to use Electroshot more than once, an incredibly powerful move that lets Arch sometimes turn into an unstoppable sweeper. But Archaladon mostly serves as a tech piece to help deal with Goldengo, the number one enemy of the Perish Trap mode. Which gives us the perfect segue to discuss what Perish Trap is. Perish Trap revolves around two main things, the move Perish Song and the ability Shadow Tag. Perish Song is a move that causes all Pokemon who hear it to faint after 3 turns. This effect can only be cleared out by switching. However, Shadow Tag prevents this as it traps all non-Ghost type Pokemon on the field. So players will use Shadow Tag to trap perished Pokemon on the field, which is where the strategy gets its title, Perish Trap. On Wolfe's team, the Shadow Tag user is Gothitelle, who additionally offers disruption and speed control for the team with Fake Out and Trick Room. And the backbone of the Perish Trap mode is again Politoed, as it is the only Perish Song user on the team. And finally, Amoonguss and Incineroar fill critical roles as supportive and disruptive Pokemon, with their incredible bulk and helpful move pools. From here, we can discuss a few uncommon choices Wolfe made. First thing to note is that all 6 Pokemon have Protect, as Protect is a critical move for the Perish Trap strategy, allowing the Perish Trap user to have turns free from damage while Perish counters tick down. Next, we can touch on the items of Politoed and Amoonguss. Politoed has the Leftovers item to help add to its longevity and bulk, as it is a critical piece to keep around for a long time, with it often being needed for multiple Perish Songs or multiple settings of Rain. Amoonguss, on the other hand, has Eject Button, a very counterintuitive item that causes Amoonguss to be switched out once it is hit by an attack, but there are 2 reasons for Wolfe choosing this item. 1. Wolfe can use it as an opportunity to bail Gothitelle out of a bad situation, swapping Gothitelle off the field and letting Amoonguss eat a hit, only for Amoonguss to swap right back out to Gothitelle, resetting its ability to click Fake Out and Protect. And 2. Only one Pokemon can be switched off the field as a result of a move, and Eject Button takes priority over the secondary effect of other moves, meaning you turning into an Eject Button holder will have the Eject Button Pokemon switching out and leave the U-turner on the field. Now that we have a solid idea of how both teams operate in a general sense, let's take a closer look into the matchup and see what conclusions we can draw. Continuing with Wolfe, first thing to note is that this is a weather war. Marco's team wants to operate with Sun, and Wolfe's in general wants to operate with Rain. This makes Politoed perhaps the most important Pokemon in the match, as it is key for controlling the weather, and with Perish Song carrying value in a number of board states, Politoed is an absolute must-bring to this match. Gothitelle is the second Pokemon that immediately jumps out as a must-bring, with its ability Shadow Tag being a critical piece of disruption for this matchup, as Shadow Tag will not only lock Pokemon on the field, but also notably lock Pokemon off the field, making it much harder for Marco to take weather control and to get the board states he wants. From here, we can look back to Wolfe's Rain mode. Kingdra is another critical piece in this matchup for two main reasons. 1. Kingdra can hit 4 of Marco's Pokemon for super effective, with most of them not even being able to Terra out of the one shot. And 2. Kingdra is the only Pokemon on the team that can one-shot Jumpluff. This requires Life Orb and Terra Stellar on a Draco Meteor, but this option is critical as Jumpluff is the scariest piece on Marco's team, as Tailwind and Sleep Powder both threaten to heavily disrupt Wolfe's strategies. For both of these reasons, Kingdra should be considered a near required bring to the matchup and an incredibly positive piece. Next up on the Rain mode, we can take a look at our Chaladon. Our Chaladon could put in work here, but its primary job is to help deal with Gholdengo and other pieces that can avoid the Perish strategy, particularly those who Kingdra can't deal with well. In this particular case, Marco lacks those options, so Arch isn't as needed. Arch also not having access to Swift Swim means that even if Wolfe is able to maintain weather control, loss of speed control will mean Arch can be KO'd by Marco before it moves. Because of this, our Chaladon probably shouldn't come to this matchup. Moving on to the two support pieces, we can take a look at Amoonguss first. While Amoonguss is a Sleep Powder immunity and in general a good supportive option, its typing is a major issue for this matchup. Marco has a plethora of ways to demolish Amoonguss with Charizard, Ursaluna, Incineroar, and Torkoal, meaning Wolfe would have to work incredibly hard to generate a position for Amoonguss to do the things it wants to, which isn't exactly an ideal situation for a support Pokemon, making Amoonguss a tough bring to this matchup. And lastly, we have Incineroar, who also offers Sleep Powder immunity through its item, as well as useful disruption and damage mitigation. This disruption alongside mid-turn pivoting is also useful for helping control the board state by helping maintain his weather control and Shadow Tag, meaning Incineroar is in a good place to come to this matchup. For Wolfe, this leaves things rather simple in terms of deciding which Pokemon to bring to the matchup, so we can now head over to Marco's side before diving into the Swiss set. First things to note for Marco are Ursaluna and Jumpluff. Ursaluna is Marco's only reliable source of damage in this matchup, as Facade hits hard in rain or sun, and its ability to Terra Ghost also lets it potentially dodge its weaknesses and Perish Trap, making it a must-bring for this matchup. And Jumpluff is Marco's most disruptive piece into Wolfe's team. Sleep Powder threatens to ruin the careful lines Wolfe will need to navigate to find his win cons, with a sleeping Kingdra or Gothitelle spelling doom for either respective mode, as just an extra turn or two for Marco can be game-winning, giving Marco access to board states where Wolfe cannot absorb the damage nor remove it prior. Tailwind is also incredibly useful for Marco, as it would allow Charizard and Jumpluff to be faster than Kingdra, even in rain, and for Ursaluna to be faster than everything else. This means Jumpluff is also a must-bring for the matchup. Looking at the 4 remaining pieces, however, things get less certain. Torkoal as a weather setter makes sense to bring to the matchup, but given Gothitelle, it may be difficult to position Torkoal properly. However, with Overheat and Eject Pack, Torkoal can possibly disrupt Perish ideas as well as swap out of the field to swap back in again in rare cases. This can make Torkoal a difficult bring, but there are routes for it to enable success for its partners. Charizard sits in a rather awkward position. If Marco does manage to take weather control, the damage from Charizard can threaten to wipe boards and deal unstoppable amounts of damage, but it's far easier said than done to actually get those board states, as Wolfe will certainly be trying to prevent it. Charizard is in a similar situation to Torkoal, with difficult routes to success. Next up is Porygon 2, who makes sense as a speed control option that helps enable Ursaluna. However, due to the speed ambiguities that exist between Ursaluna and a lot of Wolfe's pieces, Trick Room might not necessarily be ideal for Ursaluna. That aside, P2 does offer immense amounts of bulk, meaning it can probably be successful in its own right if Marco can find a way to eliminate Wolfe's Perish option. But if Wolfe is able to successfully press on the Perish angle, P2 may end up becoming a rather passive piece that wastes space on Marco's board. P2 is definitely a candidate to bring to the match, but also has its downsides as well. Last up, we have Incineroar, who is a great option for this matchup. Its ability to disrupt rain through Parting Shot and Fake Out, as well as Perish Trap through navigating around Shadow Tag, make it an ideal candidate. However, Incine's typing lends it to being caught out by Politoed and Kingdra, meaning it may have to use the Terra Ursaluna once in some situations. Overall, Incineroar is a solid bring to this match. With all of this now said and done, we can now get ready to briefly go through Wolfe and Marco's Swiss set in round 8. Hey, sorry to interrupt the video for a moment, just wanted to say if you're enjoying it so far and you would like to see more, I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to subscribe. It helps out a ton. Anyways, back to the video. In Game 1, we see Wolfe open up with Kingdra and Gothitelle while Marco leads with Jumpluff and Torkoal. Marco's lead was anticipating Politoed in the front from Wolfe, looking to use Jumpluff's speed to shut down any supporting threats like Gothitelle trying to hold the field hostage, while Torkoal can disrupt both the Rain and Perish modes with Drought and Eject Pack respectively. If Wolfe had led Politoed, he would definitely be on the back foot, regardless if the partner was Kingdra or Gothitelle. Wolfe's lead on the other hand is a great flexible lead. Gothitelle allows him to disrupt Marco's ability to adapt on the fly, trapping Marco's board state, and potentially priming the board for a Perish trap. And Kingdra threatens to benefit from the Rain mode immediately, as Politoed can switch in for Gothitelle right away, allowing Kingdra to get a powerful attack off into an important target. Unfortunately for Marco, Jumpluff lacks the ability to protect, meaning there's nothing he can do now to stop Wolfe from swapping in Politoed and KOing Jumpluff with a Terrastellar Draco Meteor. Marco makes the best of the situation, using Jumpluff as a clearance sacrifice to create a position where Ursaluna is burned and Sun is set up, by having Torkoal overheat and Eject Pack out into Ursaluna and swapping it back in on the Jumpluff slot. From this position, Marco and Wolfe trade pieces down until it looks like Wolfe will be able to capitalize on his lead with a powerful Muddy Water, but this crucially misses Charizard, allowing for the margins of the game to get incredibly close. This eventually results in an endgame of a substantially injured Politoed versus a Torkoal in the Sun. Due to the Weather War being lost, and Politoed being relatively low on health already, it seems like Marco will take this endgame. But thanks to Wolfe's selection of leftovers on Politoed, Politoed is able to just barely pull through the endgame, eating all of Torkoal's eruptions while slowly chipping it down in return, making Game 1 a victory for Wolfe. Looking back at Game 1, we can already make some key observations. First, Torkoal wasn't effective in the Weather War, and in general was a difficult piece to position, with Gothitelle being a major disruptor to Torkoal in the lead and in the back. And second, Wolfe's lead seems to be the thing to beat, as Wolfe's game plan was so strong that he was able to claim a win even despite a critical miss from Kingdra. This means the onus is squarely on Marco to adjust to Wolfe's game plan, and it will likely involve benching Torkoal. Continuing onward into Game 2, we see Marco try out a new lead with Porygon 2 and Jumpluff, while Wolfe maintains the same lead as before. Marco's new idea is to get Trick Room set up as Jumpluff is KO'd, allowing for Ursaluna to have speed control against Kingdra, making things more difficult for Wolfe after their initial turn 1. However, now we get to see the flexibility of Wolfe's lead shine, as he sees a passive board before him, one prime for Perish Song. Wolfe switches gears by swapping out Kingdra into Incineroar, while Gothitelle chips away at Jumpluff. The purpose of this is to try and find a safe way to swap Politoed on the field, using Incineroar as a safe switch-in against Sleep Powder, hoping to use Parting Shot as a means of getting Politoed in without any risk. But Marco sets up Trick Room, meaning Incin's Parting Shot will go before Jumpluff's Sleep Powder. However, Wolfe commits to the play, and it works, with Sleep Powder targeting the Gothitelle slot and missing anyways. From here, Marco plays to force Politoed to Terra Grass, and it does, allowing Wolfe to set up Perish and undo Trick Room. Now from here on turn 3, barring Ice Beam freezes, critical hits, and consecutive protects, Wolfe has guaranteed win on the board. Trust me, I checked. After Wolfe executes his Perish Trap with some fancy footwork from Incineroar, Gothitelle, and Politoed, Wolfe gets an endgame of all of his Pokemon versus Ursaluna and Charizard, which Wolfe is able to make short work of with Kingdra after getting Rain set up again, giving Wolfe the second game and the win in their Swiss set. From here, both players went on to play well for the rest of the tournament, both finding their way into Top Cut after having success in their Swiss rounds in Day 2. And from there, both had impressive displays, with Marco and Wolfe having incredibly clutch semi-final matches. But playing those matches wasn't the only thing they did in between their Swiss match and their finals rematch. Marco went back to the drawing board, thinking over what ways he could push Wolfe's team. And here, we can hypothesize what some of these reconsiderations might have been by taking a look ourselves. First thing to note, Charizard without Torkoal seems incredibly difficult to get into the right position, as Charizard needs access to Sun to function in this matchup. But Marco has to dedicate a lot of resources to ensure he is winning the Weather War, which likely comes at the cost of getting Charizard in at the right time, or costs so many pieces that it doesn't matter Charizard is where it wants to be. So for that reason, Charizard shouldn't be brought to this matchup moving forward, which leaves us for two options for replacing it, Torkoal and Incineroar. Incineroar here seems like the reasonable candidate, and looking back at what we said during the preview of the matchup, Incin makes even more sense. With Fake Out, it can disrupt the Rain Hyper Offense line from Wolfe, and with Parting Shot, it can dodge out of Perish Trap to set up Ursaluna for dealing good damage, giving Marco ways to handle both of Wolfe's branching paths from the lead he went with in their first set. This means that Marco will be nearly all in on Ursaluna for damage, so he will have to keep that in mind when looking for optimal board states to try and win the game from. Even if he can disrupt a lot of Wolfe's strategies with Jump Bluff and Incineroar, if he can't get Ursaluna into a position to take advantage of the disruption, Wolfe will be able to recover and regain control over the board eventually. Over the course of the first set, we managed to learn a lot of things about the speed tiers between Marco's and Wolfe's Pokemon, and I'd like to list out that information for you now, as it can help you keep track of what's relevant in the upcoming set. As you can tell, we know all the relevant speed information here except for one piece, Marco's Incineroar. At this point, Marco likely knows where his Incin sits on this graph, and one might reasonably think that it has some amount of speed investment to make it benefit from Tailwind, but Wolfe, much like us, doesn't know for certain just how fast Marco's Incin is. Now, keeping that in mind, we are ready to take a deep dive into the final set, and not a minute too late. Wolfe still leads Kingdra and Gothitelle, asking Marco to prove it's possible to beat it, and Marco unveils a new lead, Incineroar and Jump Bluff. We can already see the pressure we talked about before coming from Marco's Incineroar onto Wolfe's side. The presence of Fake Out and Parting Shot completely disrupts the safe options Wolfe had set up, so Wolfe is going to need to unveil a new idea or accept the risks of Sleep Powder. Going into turn 1, we see Wolfe look to reposition Gothitelle away from Sleep Powder by switching in Incin, while Kingdra goes for a Draco Meteor into Jump Bluff. If Kingdra isn't faked out, the goal is to put Jump Bluff low enough that Incin will be able to remove it with a knockoff, which would disrupt Marco's main method of denying Wolfe's Rain mode. Marco, on the other hand, looks to try and secure speed control as Fake Out plus Sleep Powder is a risky play since Kingdra can protect. Since Marco is in a precarious position from the get-go against Wolfe's team, he will have to take risks and make aggressive reads in order to reach a neutral or advantageous position. Hence why he goes for Tailwind to ensure Jump Bluff will be faster than Kingdra even with Rain Up, and goes for a knockoff into the Kingdra slot, assuming Wolfe will do something about the threat of Sleep Powder, like swap in Incin or Protect. However, due to Wolfe taking the risk of Kingdra getting slept, Wolfe is able to critically remove most of Jump Bluff's HP, meaning that losing Life Orb isn't that big of a deal in return. Now with Incin on the field, Wolfe carries knockoff pressure into Jump Bluff, which may have the potential to KO Jump Bluff, but if Marco doesn't want it to happen, he could Parting Shot Wolfe's Incin before it moves. Which is something Marco is already incentivized to do as he wants to safely bring Ursaluna onto the field. Marco now throws his Sleep Powder towards Kingdra, forcing whatever's in that slot to sleep 75% of the time, as Wolfe doesn't have a Sleep Powder immune Pokemon in the back to catch it, since Incin is already on the field. But Wolfe here makes an excellent observation. He knows that letting any piece aside from Kingdra fall asleep is bad news, and so he decides to let Kingdra fall asleep on purpose so it can start getting through its sleep turns faster. Marco then Parting Shots onto Wolfe's Incineroar, bringing in Ursaluna. However, Wolfe saw that Marco's board state looked passive and expected that he may want to reduce Incin's damage output to save Jump Bluff and reposition to a better board state, so Wolfe decided to instead knock off the Incin slot, removing Ursaluna's Flame Orb, permanently weakening Ursaluna, especially in regards to its facade. This is a huge deal, as Ursaluna is Marco's main damage dealer, and without access to a powerful facade, Ursaluna will have to use Headlong Rush in many situations in order to get meaningful damage onto the right targets, leaving it more vulnerable to damage and retaliation. Looking forward, it's also important to note that Wolfe want to make sure he can preserve his Incineroar for later, as it's an important piece for disrupting Jump Bluff and Ursaluna, which he might need to do again later. He may also want Knockoff for later to remove P2's Eviolite, making it easier to KO if the Perish Trap strategy is somehow off the table in the future. And on Marco's end, he wants to start moving pieces as quickly as possible, while making sure he can maintain speed control for Ursaluna. Both Marco and Wolfe Terra Ghost their Pokemon, and then Marco swaps Jump Bluff into P2 and Headlong Rushes Wolfe's now Ghost-type Incineroar. Kingdra then wakes up and attempts to Draco Meteor the Jump Bluff again in an attempt to KO it, but only ends up chipping P2. Wolfe then rounds out the turn by Parting Shotting into Ursaluna in order to bring Gothitelle to the field. By swapping Jump Bluff out into P2, Marco is hoping to get Trick Room speed control as Tailwind ends, and also have P2 in a good position to deal damage, which is better than what Jump Bluff might offer if it was trapped on the field. Marco's Terra is also good future planning, as he won't be able to swap out Ursaluna at the same time that he Terras it, meaning Wolfe will have to consider more possibilities, as he won't be able to force Ursaluna to stay on the field for at least one turn. And as a side note, Ursaluna was almost always the choice of Terra anyways for Marco in this game, so it doesn't hurt him much to reveal it now. Wolfe, on the other hand, has gotten himself into a somewhat decent position now. Despite not being able to KO Jumpluff, he has managed to prevent it from being on the field at the same time as Ursaluna, thanks to Gothitel's Shadow Tag. And Wolfe's parting shot on the Ursaluna is also good progress, as it makes Ursaluna even less effective on the current board state, leaving Marco with nothing but tough choices. Since Wolfe now has the board mostly paralyzed, he should be looking to angle for a board position where Politoed or Kingdra can remove Ursaluna, and then the remaining pieces through Perish Song or Weather Ball. And if Marco attempts to dodge this by swapping Ursaluna out, he will either be giving up Incineroar or stepping into a passive board state of Jumpluff and P2. On the other side, Marco's win con is still the same as before. He needs to try and remove pieces from the board while still giving proper support to Ursaluna. If he can manage to remove Wolfe's Perish option, he can also play to a P2 endgame as well, as Gothitelle and Incin may have a hard time removing P2 when it can recover HP. Meaning Marco probably wants to remove Gothitelle from the field so he can swap out of Perish Song, or alternatively, Marco can go for pressuring the non-Gothitelle slot, trying to deny Perish from getting set up in the first place. Wolfe now swaps Kingdra out for Politoed and has Gothitelle Psychic Ursaluna. Marco puts down damage on the Kingdra slot with another Headlong Rush, dropping its defenses even more, while P2 sets up Trick Room. Marco's play here is a simple execution of his pressure. He attempts to maintain Ursaluna's speed advantage versus Politoed and Kingdra by setting up Trick Room, and lays down damage into the Kingdra slot, which was threatening to KO Incin or put good damage down on Kingdra or Politoed. Even if Kingdra protected, the move would still make decent progress, as Ursaluna could just Headlong Rush that slot again. However, setting up Trick Room critically gave Wolfe the speed advantage he needed with Gothitelle, and by swapping in Politoed, Wolfe is able to absorb the Headlong Rush well, as lefties can allow him to regain a lot of the lost HP over time. And due to Ursaluna needing to use Headlong Rush over Facade for high damage, Gothitelle's Psychic deals huge damage to Ursaluna, putting it in range of another one. Now thanks to the speed control being handed over to Gothitelle, Wolfe is able to threaten a KO on Ursaluna, with no easy switch in as Politoed's Weather Ball will threaten to remove Incin if it swaps in to eat the hit. It looks like Wolfe is going to be able to remove some pieces here, and if the piece that is removed is Ursaluna, he should be looking good for his win con. Marco, on the other hand, is looking to be in a bad position. Despite the early advantage he held, Wolfe's speed sandwich with Gothitelle and Politoed on Ursaluna has put Marco in a place where it is now difficult to get an attack off with Ursaluna. The damage on Ursaluna adding up much faster than it should is also a major problem for Marco's win con. But Marco still may have a narrow path to victory. If he can remove Politoed from the field and reposition, he might be able to find a way through Wolfe's team with Ursaluna later on, perhaps through another Jumpluff Tailwind. Heading to the next turn, we see Marco protects Ursaluna while P2 chips away at Politoed, and Wolfe goes for a Psychic into Ursaluna, but Politoed goes for a Perish Song instead of Weather Ball. Marco's game plan here is to chip away at Politoed in hopes of removing Wolfe's Rain piece while Wolfe tries to execute on its pin, but the plan doesn't go as expected. Wolfe decides to play for a different angle than executing on the pin, despite not having the board fully trapped. Wolfe realizes that Ursaluna is effectively forced to switch in now because of Gothitelle, and P2 doesn't provide much offensive output either. He uses this opportunity to Perish Song P2, knowing that for the next 3 turns, Marco won't be able to place much offensive pressure on the board, allowing for Wolfe to set a timer on P2's life while still being able to pressure the Ursaluna slot in future turns. Even if Marco had switched in Incin for Ursaluna on that turn, Wolfe would have been able to pivot in his own Incineroar to help mitigate damage being done to Gothitelle and help delay Gothitelle's death for just long enough to catch P2 out as well. As -1 knockoff and Terra Blast wouldn't be enough to KO Gothitelle while it protects on the other 2 turns. The board state now looks incredibly poor for Marco as P2 is on a timer and Ursaluna is forced to switch out, while Politoed can look to pivot out, clearing its Perish counter, and Gothitelle can spend another turn safe without needing to protect. Wolfe looks to be fully taking control of the game now, as he holds all the pressure. Marco now swaps out Ursaluna for Jumpluff, while Wolfe swaps out Politoed for Incineroar. Gothitelle then Psychics the incoming Jumpluff, and P2 chips away a little bit more at Gothitelle with the Terra Blast. Marco's game plan has changed, as he is looking to sacrifice Jumpluff to try and get Ursaluna back in a turn early. Marco's hope is that he can remove Gothitelle with Ursaluna after its stat drops have been cleared. This would allow for P2 to switch out and clear its Perish Song counter, but unfortunately for Marco, this plan is cut short as Jumpluff hangs on with a smidge of HP, paralyzing Marco's board state and ensuring P2 will faint. Wolfe now just has to focus on removing Jumpluff from the field to deny any future tailwinds, and then he can wait out the Perish counter and Trick Room to have secured a reigned endgame against Incin and Ursaluna. Wolfe now fake outs the P2 and Psychics Jumpluff. Marco then brings in Incineroar onto the field to replace Jumpluff. Wolfe's fake out into P2 is an important denial, as it stops P2 from being able to undo Trick Room on this turn and reset the following, which would give Ursaluna the opportunity to hit Kingdra and Politoed before they can move. From here, the game should now be over, barring some kind of ridiculous RNG with consecutive protects and Draco misses from Kingdra. Wolfe now protects Incin to keep it safe from Marco's knockoff and lets Gothitelle and P2 faint, after which Wolfe brings in Kingdra and Marco brings in Ursaluna. It's worth mentioning Marco could have went for Parting Shot to sustain the fake out option for another turn, but instead played for Wolfe, making a mistake. From here, Wolfe swaps Politoed in on the Incin slot and Weatherballs the Ursaluna, KOing it. Marco then goes for a knockoff into the Kingdra. Here, Wolfe chooses to attack Ursaluna despite it having the ability to protect because it is Marco's most reasonable way back into the game. If Ursaluna manages to get an Earthquake off, it could potentially KO Politoed and Kingdra with some critical hits, leaving Ursaluna in a winning board state versus Wolfe's slower and low HP Incineroar. And Marco rightfully went for this play, hoping to catch a mistake and get lucky, but this just results in the game ending sooner. With a board state of Kingdra and Politoed in the rain versus Incin, Marco concedes the match and we head to Game 2. Let's take a moment to break down what happened in Game 1. First, Marco found a lead that makes both immediate Perish Trap and immediate Rain Hyper Offense not near instant wins, with Fake Out buying Jumpluff the time it needs and Incin providing the proper pivoting to deny Perish. Second, the early damage on Jumpluff was critical for giving Wolfe this avenue, as Jumpluff having low HP forced Marco to be far more conservative in his usage of it. Third, removing Ursaluna's Flame Orb was critical for disrupting Marco's game plan and giving Wolfe a position where he could manage Ursaluna through chip from his supporting pieces like Gothitelle, Politoed, and Incineroar. And fourth, as a result of points 2 and 3, Marco was eventually forced into a passive position, which Wolfe then punished with a Perish Song as a way to remove Marco's options for speed control from the field, allowing for a rain-centered endgame. Now let's think about what the players can improve on for the next game. Marco needs to find a safer way to get Ursaluna in, so Ursaluna can start removing Wolfe's pieces and dismantling both of his win cons with Facade. This can be achieved through an earlier Parting Shot as opposed to a knockoff, or through different means entirely, such as setting up Trick Room first and then using a delayed Parting Shot to pivot out to Ursaluna. Marco has to be careful here though. If too much time passes before getting Ursaluna in, Wolfe might be able to chip away at his supporting pieces and leave Ursaluna vulnerable to major damage from Kingdra, which will make Ursaluna's damage output irrelevant. Wolfe, on the other hand, will have to more or less play the same strategies as before, adapting to what Marco throws at him and finding the best way to lock him out of the board. However, it's worth noting that Marco might not allow Wolfe to Draco Meteor the Jumpluff again, so his Game 1 play has considerably more risk than it did before, which was still a risky play even then. And it's also worth noting that Wolfe wasted half of his turn 1 swapping from Gothitelle to Incineroar, meaning if Marco is to attempt the same lead, Wolfe can gain a half tempo on the game by starting with Incin in his lead over Gothitelle. Heading into Game 2, we now see the leads of Jumpluff and Incineroar from Marco, and Incineroar and Kingdra from Wolfe. Marco has kept his lead the same, telling Wolfe the issue with the previous game was with how his mid and early game shook out, not with his lead. But Wolfe has made the switch we discussed, attempting to gain a half tempo seeing that Marco has found a way to handle Gothitelle. However, with this lead there is an important distinction to make. Marco has a forced Tailwind if he so desires now, with no Trick Room from Gothitelle to punish it, meaning Fake Out, Kingdra, Tailwind seems much safer. Wolfe respects the threat of Fake Out and Spore this turn, protecting Kingdra, and Marco goes for his safe play of Fake Out into Kingdra and setting up Tailwind. Wolfe then rounds out the turn with Knockoff into Jumpluff, removing its Covert Cloak. Wolfe is now in an awkward spot. Incineroar can trap both Pokemon on the field if Marco wants to stay absolutely safe in regards to keeping Ursaluna's Flame Orb, but it can't actually make much progress if this doesn't happen. Wolfe also cannot stop a Sleep Powder from hitting the Kingdra slot barring luck, meaning he is likely to have a passive board state moving forward. Meaning Marco has managed to create a positive board state for himself. Because of this, Marco can now go for Sleep Powder into the Kingdra slot and Knockoff into the Incineroar slot. Meaning he can remove Goggles to try and create a safe reposition for Ursaluna the following turn, with pivot options for Wolfe not looking like reasonable candidates for eating a knockoff. Wolfe is likely going to have to play through sleep turns and or Sleep Powder misses at this point, but if an early wake up can occur, or if Kingdra can outright dodge the Sleep Powder and land the Draco on Jumpluff, we may see a similar position to Game 1 occur. Heading into the next turn, Marco puts Kingdra to sleep and knocks off Wolfe's Incin slot, as Kingdra takes its first turn of sleep and Wolfe Parting Shots Incineroar out to Gothitelle. Marco here goes for his most reasonable play, not risking a repeat of Game 1 and instead working to remove Wolfe's sleep immunities while also shutting down Kingdra. Wolfe has no choice here but to try and burn through sleep turns or sleep powder misses, and he also attempts to pivot in Gothitelle to try and have Fake Out ready for Jumpluff the following turn, so if sleep powder does miss, Kingdra can KO Jumpluff that turn with another Draco. This board state looks okay for now for Wolfe, as he will get another passive turn from Marco to try and burn sleep with, but Ursaluna is on the horizon. Wolfe now fakes out the Jumpluff and burns his second turn of sleep with Kingdra, while Marco parting shots his own Jumpluff so Incineroar can guarantee its switch to Ursaluna. Marco takes the risk of a first turn wake up from Kingdra and goes for getting Ursaluna on the field now while he still has Tailwind, and uses a side parting shot here as a bit of fancy footwork, stopping Wolfe from using his Protect to deny the parting shot. Now Marco has the position he's been looking for. Facade is online, and Wolfe is going to have to bleed pieces to have any chance of removing Ursaluna, and if Kingdra stays asleep for its final turn of sleep, Wolfe will likely be too far behind to win the game. Wolfe now has to decide between trying to mitigate the damage Ursaluna can deal with Incineroar, or trying to switch Politoed in to set up the rain, which can allow Kingdra to deal great damage to Ursaluna, but Marco actually has a play here that prevents this from working. Heading into the next turn, Wolfe chooses to execute on the rain play, swapping in Politoed and Terra Stellaring Kingdra, hoping for a wake up. But Marco covers for this play, setting up Sunny Day with Jumpluff preemptively, and then Earthquaking with Ursaluna, who eats the Fire-type Weather Ball decently well. Looking back at the start of the turn, Wolfe actually did have a way around Marco's play, as if he had instead gone for a double Protect, he would have burned Marco's final turn of Tailwind, meaning Jumpluff wouldn't have been able to set up the Sun before Kingdra had the chance to attack. Of course, this doesn't win the game, but it would have placed Marco on the back foot and put him in a difficult position where he might lose Jumpluff for nothing as Ursaluna protects, or lose Ursaluna if Wolfe calls the Protect isn't happening. However, snapping back to the current board state, Wolfe's position isn't looking great here, as keeping Politoed healthy was a big part of his Paris Song endgame after removing Ursaluna, but now Politoed may not have enough HP to beat out Porygon 2 and Incineroar, even if it isn't hit by Ursaluna again. But the even more unfortunate news is that Ursaluna is certainly going to get to move again, as Tailwind can be set up again and nothing can stop another Earthquake from coming through. Even if Wolfe uses Incineroar to intimidate Ursaluna, an intimidated Earthquake is still KOing Kingdra and Politoed and putting Incin in range of a second Earthquake, meaning Wolfe is going to have to give up a piece soon or trade away all of his HP to be stuck with Incineroar and Gothitelle on the board. From here, it now looks near impossible for Wolfe to win the set. Marco can simply just Tailwind and Earthquake, and if Incin ever hits the field, Marco can counter this by using Terra Ghost and Sunny Day, as Terra Ghost covers for Fake Out and Sunny Day covers for Politoed switching back in. Wolfe, however, does have one option left that might work. If he can sack Incineroar at the right time and get Trick Room up with Gothitelle, Politoed and Gothitelle might be able to remove Ursaluna while having speed control. Wolfe plays towards his final line, swapping Kingdra and Politoed out for Incineroar and Gothitelle, while Marco goes for his reasonable play again, setting up Tailwind and Earthquaking, leaving Incineroar barely alive and dealing under 50% to Gothitelle. We are still on Wolfe's one line towards a potential victory, but Marco still has ways to punish this, as he can now focus on removing Gothitelle from the field with a Facade, accepting that Incineroar may pivot, but understanding that speed control is the most vital thing to his success, even if Wolfe's Mons are so low on HP. Heading into the next turn, Marco tries to hold on to his Terra, expecting Wolfe will likely try and prevent the Sleep Powder with Fake Out. But the turn goes horribly wrong for Marco. Ursaluna gets faked out, taking additional chip that puts it in range of 3 burn ticks, and Jumpluff misses the Sleep Powder, allowing for Gothitelle to set up Trick Room. For the next 3 turns, Wolfe will now have complete speed control versus Ursaluna, except for when Kingdra is in rain, meaning Marco is going to likely need to preserve Ursaluna and or Jumpluff for later, but they aren't able to switch out right away, thanks to Shadow Tag. But Marco knows that Jumpluff cannot be KO'd this turn barring crits, so it can actually protect Ursaluna from dying this turn by Rage Powdering away Incin and Gothitelle's attacks, since Incineroar's goggles were knocked off earlier. This gives Ursaluna the space to attack again, which would mean Marco can guaranteed remove one of Wolfe's pieces or force Wolfe to stall out a turn of his own Trick Room. However, stalling out a turn of his own Trick Room is fine for Wolfe, as protecting with both Incin and Gothitelle puts Ursaluna in range of one more burn tick, giving it only till the end of turn 8 to live. Heading into the next turn, Marco then Rage Powders, forcing Gothitelle and Incineroar to attack it, and Incin lands a critical hit, causing Jumpluff to die, which we will talk about after the game. Ursaluna then KOs Wolfe's Incineroar and chips Gothitelle with Earthquake. Then Ursaluna faints from its own burn, leaving Incineroar and P2 to handle Wolfe's remaining pieces. Marco then sends out Incineroar and P2 while Wolfe sends out Politoed, and the final piece of speed control information is revealed, as we see Politoed's Rain activate before Incineroar's Intimidate, showing us Incineroar is the faster Pokemon. Now with P2 and Ensign on the field at the same time, Marco can play to a win that only requires him to get a single read right, calling whether or not Kingdra switches in on the right slot. If Marco doesn't undo Trick Room here, Polito will be slower than Incineroar and get off a Weather Ball into Ensign the following turn, putting Incineroar in range of a Muddy Water from Terra Stellar Kingdra. And if P2 were to get hit by Psychic from Gothitelle and receive a Spadef drop, P2 might not be able to beat both Kingdra and Gothitelle after the Muddy Water damage. On the other hand, if P2 does undo Trick Room as Ensign fakes out Politoed, Kingdra could switch in and threaten to remove Ensign immediately with Terra Stellar Weather Ball, allowing Politoed to encore P2 into Trick Room, ensuring a converted endgame from that point on. Moving into turn 9, Marco calls for Wolfe not to swap Kingdra in and gets the call right, undoing Trick Room as Wolfe double protects. Then, on the next turn, Marco's Incineroar KOs Polito with a knockoff, critically saving his P2 from Encore, while P2 then goes for a Terra Blast into Gothitelle, putting it in range of another Terra Blast. Gothitelle then Psychics P2 back, getting a Spadef drop. Wolfe then ends the turn by swapping in Kingdra. This drop raises tension, as there's now potentially a chance that Kingdra could get its damage over the line with Muddy Water. Looking at the next turn, Wolfe then has Kingdra go for a Stellar Muddy Water, but it's just barely not enough to KO either of Marco's Pokemon, and Ensign in return then KOs Kingdra while P2 KOs Gothitelle, securing Game 2 for Marco. From here, I would like to discuss the critical hit onto Jumpluff. By not KOing Jumpluff, only Incineroar or P2 would have been able to hit the field. If Marco had swapped in P2, he would have introduced a bunch of 50-50s revolving around calling what move Gothitelle clicks for a Perish-related endgame that results in Kingdra versus Incineroar. But if he swaps in Incineroar, Marco is able to generate the same position we got in game, except he's a tempo behind, as P2 will hit the board a turn later and be unable to undo Trick Room while Ensign fakes out. This means that Polito would for sure be able to get its Weather Ball off into Incineroar, meaning that in the case of P2 and Gothitelle, if Gothitelle got the Spadef drop like it did in the actual game, Wolfe's Muddy Water would now kill Ensign unlike before and leave P2 low enough to die to the next incoming attack, as with Ensign gone, P2 would only be able to KO one of Gothitelle or Kingdra. Which is interesting to think that getting critically hit actually made Wolfe lose the game, given all other luck stays the same.
What?
Anyways, now we can move on to breaking down Game 2. First, despite Wolfe changing his leads to gain a tempo on what his previous play was, he is still stuck playing the same kind of line in Game 1. And by not leading Gothitelle, he actually loses access to a Trick Room hard call play that could potentially make Marco decide against Tailwind on turn 1. Second, Marco on the other hand did a better job of keeping Jumpluff's HP around and managed to generate a better position for Ursaluna by getting it on the field while Incineroar wasn't present from Wolfe's side. And third, this plus speed control from Jumpluff allowed Marco to damage trade effectively, dwindling Wolfe's resources too low for the endgame, meaning P2 and Incineroar could chew through the remaining pieces before Perish or Rain Hyper Offense could knock them out. Now normally here I would list out what adaptations should be made for a stronger early game, or what kind of mid-game adaptations need to be made, but these players are now in Game 5, and Marco has demonstrated that the lines Wolfe was playing to have not been as safe as they seemed in their Swiss set. In fact, it's worth mentioning how well Marco has played, being able to pressure Wolfe despite being in a matchup where he is forced to play his team in a highly peculiar way, not using two of the main pieces, one of which would be considered the core piece of the team, Torkoal. And as a result of this incredible play, Wolfe makes the call to shift from safe long-term game plans to applying a different board state pressure while trying to capitalize off of the tendencies he and Marco have both shown throughout their games. And instead of covering the reasons behind this change from Wolfe before the game starts, I instead would like to cover the trap he lays out once it's been set, so we can move right into Game 3. Marco again leads Jumpluff and Incineroar, while Wolfe leads Politoed and Kingdra. Wolfe has kept Politoed in the back to better help with weather control for all 4 games up to now, so why did he switch to leading Politoed, especially when Marco could just activate Sun with Jumpluff and shut everything down? Well, this is Wolfe's trap. Over the course of their games, Wolfe has conditioned Marco into considering Torkoal a bad piece to bring to the matchup, and Marco has responded to this by not bringing Torkoal since their first game. However, this means Wolfe no longer has to fear a switch in or lead from Torkoal, allowing him to be confident that Kingdra can have at least one turn will it be faster than Jumpluff. But one turn isn't enough to gain an advantage over Marco, as he is using Incineroar and has Fake Out to stall Kingdra for that one turn, which leads us to the trap Wolfe is setting. By leading Kingdra and Politoed, Wolfe is making it clear he intends to be offensive, not on the first turn because of Fake Out, but on the second. But that begs the question, how does Wolfe intend to keep the offensive pressure for an extra turn? Well, one way is he can swap Politoed out as Jumpluff sets Sunny Day, allowing Politoed to switch back in to take weather control on turn 2, using Incineroar as a means of denying Sleep Powder in the meantime. And paying attention to how Wolfe has played thus far, this is a reasonable expectation for Wolfe to go for, as Wolfe has shown his plans often involve removing Jumpluff quickly or dancing around Sleep Powder with Incineroar. So taking that into account, Marco may want to make a play that ensures Jumpluff will maintain its speed control even if weather is changed, going for a Tailwind so the following turn it can still apply Sleep Powder pressure to Kingdra. But swapping Politoed out isn't the real threat Wolfe is intending to use here. Wolfe doesn't really need speed control against Jumpluff, he just needs to stop it from using Sleep Powder on Kingdra, and this he can do with Encore. Encore is typically used to lock the opponent into a poor move choice and is often carried by fast Pokemon, so after you see what the opponent does, you can disrupt your opponent's plans, encouraging a switch out or punishing the lack of it. But Encore can also be used preemptively to lock a Pokemon into a move right as it uses it, and in this case, Wolfe's reward for doing that would be making Marco's Jumpluff dead weight on the board, freeing Kingdra to lay down damage across the board without fear of Sleep Powders, giving him massive early momentum in the game as Marco's Pokemon would be completely out of position. Now that we understand the purpose and goal behind Wolfe's lead, we can watch turn 1 play out.
That is a very dangerous prospect. Kingdra with the Protect, though, of course, when you are looking at this fake out pressure on the opposing end, it is something that only the one actually, the Politoed didn't protect.
No, it didn't. An Encore or Weather Ball here could be very devastating for Marco if Wolfe calls this correctly. Tailwind is set up, which establishes the speed advantage, but what did this Politoed do?
That's going to be the Encore, and into this Jumpluff. It's not going to have the opportunity to go for the Sunny Day on the next turn.
The trap worked. Marco now needs to plan his way back into a more neutral board state before Wolfe can get too far ahead. Marco hard swaps Jumpluff into P2 and Terra Ghosts the Incineroar so it can live the incoming attack. Wolfe then Weather Balls the Incineroar with Kingdra, dealing great damage, and Incineroar parting shot to the Kingdra to bring Jumpluff back to the field, who promptly also takes a Weather Ball from Politoed. Marco recognizes that Jumpluff carries too much value to be lost, and his only reasonable switch in for the possible combination of attacks is P2, so he swaps P2 in. And at the same time, letting Incin go down or Ursaluna go down would be potentially game losing, as Wolfe's Paris strategy would become much more effective, so Marco commits Terra Ghost onto Incineroar to help it survive the Weather Ball from Kingdra while it pivots out to stay safe for later. Wolfe, on the other hand, chooses to commit 2 Weather Balls down, spreading damage across Marco's team. It might seem appetizing to commit Terra Stellar to Kingdra now in order to try and snipe Incineroar even with a Terra, but in doing so, Wolfe knows he could potentially let Jumpluff back on the field without Terra Grass as an option to avoid Sleep Powders. So instead, Wolfe holds onto his Terra for later. It's also worth noting that the damage done to Jumpluff by Politoed is enough to most likely put it in range of a normal Life Orb boosted Draco Meteor, although Kingdra will need to switch out in order to clear its drops first, if that's Wolfe's intent. Now back to turn 3, looking at the board state at the start of this turn, if we imagine that Kingdra was a Gothitelle, we can see that Wolfe would be in an incredible board state, one he worked to achieve in Game 2 of their Swiss set. And given that Incineroar is already low and Ursaluna has no Terra available, the position would likely be even worse for Marco. But Marco recognizes this, and Wolfe recognizes Marco recognizing this, so both plan accordingly this turn. Wolfe swaps Kingdra out for Incineroar, and Marco swaps Ursaluna in for P2. Wolfe then Terra Grasses Politoed, covering for the Sleep Powder that was headed its way from Jumpluff, and Politoed sets up Perish Song. Marco gets Ursaluna in before Shadow Tag might potentially lock the field, taking advantage of what he expects to be a passive turn from Wolfe, hoping that Ursaluna's offensive power would be enough to break through Wolfe's Perish Trap strategy before it can finish, and uses Jumpluff to force Politoed to Terra Grass, denying Incineroar or Kingdra their Terras in the future. Wolfe, on the other hand, wants to take no risks at this point, and knows that Marco likely won't let the field stay the same. So instead, he brings in Incineroar to help mitigate damage next turn with no fear of Sleep Powder, and sets up a Perish Song with Politoed. Now, if Marco chooses to be aggressive here, a well-placed Gothitelle switch-in could be catastrophic for him. But if he chooses to be passive and pivot out again, Wolfe might get even more free damage or potentially trap P2 on the field again for another future Perish Song. Heading into the next turn, Wolfe goes for Fake Out and Weather Ball into Ursaluna, going for his safest option, as swapping Gothitelle in runs the risk of it getting sniped by Ursaluna or slept by Jumpluff. and Marco also goes for a relatively safe play, setting up Sun to deny super effective Weather Balls into Ursaluna, and has Ursaluna attempt for an Earthquake, which would have done reasonable damage to any Pokemon except Politoed and outright KO'd Incin. Both players are effectively playing a game of chicken over who's going to do something about the Perish counters first, and both get through the first round without doing anything about it. All of the Mon's Perish counters now fall to 2. Heading into the next turn, Marco swaps Jumpluff out to P2, clearing its Perish counter, but keeps Ursaluna in, attempting to kill whatever ends up in the Incineroar slot with a Facade. But Wolfe continues the game of chicken and double protects with both Politoed and Incineroar, keeping them safe from potential attacks. At first, this might seem like a huge call on Wolfe's end, but if Marco was to bail out and double swap, Wolfe could much more easily pivot out as P2 and Incineroar aren't nearly as threatening as Ursaluna, meaning he could safely get Gothitelle onto the field, and with the HP running low on Ursaluna and Incineroar, Kingdra would be okay with getting its Life Orb knocked off on switch-in. And from that point, Wolfe would be able to deal out huge damage with Kingdra or pivot right back in for another Perish Trap, with P2 now being stuck on the field. Returning to the current board state though, Ursaluna and Politoed and Wolfe's Incineroar are all on their last Perish counter, meaning if they want to do anything other than switch out, they will die at the end of the turn. Wolfe now swaps Politoed out for Gothitelle and has Incineroar attempt for a parting shot to safely bring Kingdra in and clear its own Perish Song counter at the last second. But Marco chooses to swap Jumpluff back onto the field and have Ursaluna Earthquake, KOing Incineroar and chunking Gothitelle. Wolfe chooses to preserve Politoed for later, as it is a critical piece for closing out the game, and has Incineroar go for a parting shot, ensuring that if Incineroar gets knocked out, it's because Ursaluna attacked it and got knocked out by Perish Song as well. And shifting to Marco's perspective, Marco decides to get some damage off with Ursaluna before it's knocked out by Perish Song, Earthquaking to maximize its damage across the board, as he swaps P2 back to Jumpluff, as it offers stronger disruption than P2 and is immune to the incoming Earthquake. As the players trade pieces, they each get to bring in their own Pokemon. For Wolfe, Kingdra seems like the ideal piece with the immediate offense it would provide into Jumpluff, which also makes the choice easy for Marco, as he needs to have Fake Out available to deny Kingdra from using Swift Swim to hit Jumpluff before it sets up Tailwind. Marco realized that preserving his Ursaluna wasn't valuable for him in the long term, as his position would be very passive as Gothitelle and Kingdra hit the field, allowing for Wolfe to start taking additional KOs in preparation for the endgame, as Marco would be right back where previous games had started with a Jumpluff and Incineroar lead against Kingdra and Gothitelle, except with far less HP available. Marco now swaps out Incineroar, bringing in P2 while Jumpluff goes for a Tailwind, while Wolfe Draco Meteors the incoming P2 and has Gothitelle set up Trick Room, punishing Marco's Tailwind. Here, Wolfe tried to remove Incineroar instead of Jumpluff for a Perish Song endgame angle, as Incineroar is the only piece left disrupting that strategy and the main damage source left for Marco. If Politoed and Gothitelle were left against P2 and Jumpluff, Perish Song would be an easy conversion for Wolfe as P2 and Jumpluff lack the proper damage to clear the field. But thanks to Marco swapping Incineroar out, he is able to avoid this outcome. Marco, on the other hand, was hoping to leverage on Fake Out and Sleep Powder pressure, putting P2 in a spot where it can potentially Ice Beam the incoming Politoed or hurt Kingdra while absorbing its hits. However, he now has P2 and Jumpluff trapped on the field, and since Tailwind is up and Trick Room is active, Kingdra and Gothitelle will both go first, meaning there is no possible way for Marco to save Jumpluff from a double up. Wolfe can now force Marco to his final 2 Pokemon, heavily limiting his options. Wolfe now Psychics and Weather Balls the Jumpluff, utilizing Jumpluff's Sunny Day against itself and KOing it. Porygon 2 then goes for freeze chances into the Kingdra, also hoping to get maximum damage down on Politoed if it does switch in for Perish Song. Then at the end of the turn, Marco brings in Incineroar. Heading straight into the next turn, Wolfe now Draco Meteors Incineroar, looking to leave P2 versus the world, but is unable to because Marco fakes out Gothitelle, sparing Incineroar for this turn, and uses Ice Beam to remove Kingdra from the field. Politoed now hits the field for Wolfe, setting up the rain. Unfortunately for Marco, speed control is still not in his favor, and Wolfe is able to eliminate Incineroar from the board before it can move. And at the same time, Wolfe has Politoed continue to damage Porygon 2. But thanks to Tailwind expiring a turn before Trick Room ends, P2 is able to weave in and recover without Politoed being able to encore it the following turn. Marco can now only hope for an Ice Beam freeze into Politoed, but it fails to come through, and Politoed and Gothitelle's double up in return leave Marco's P2 far too little HP, with the crit just being added insult to injury. With Trick Room expiring at the end of this turn, it is now impossible for Marco to win this game, and on the following turn, Politoed closes out the game with a final Weather Ball. With this, Wolfe wins the set, claiming victory over not only the match, not only Toronto, but also his 10th regional win, breaking his own record yet again. From its unique position as a rematch, to the caliber of the players and display of their skills, and to its circumstances as the closing set on Regulation H, as well as Wolfe's 10th regional title, I hope I have shown what makes this match the best of 2024. And I also hope that digging into the finer details of this match has helped you all find something that made you grow as a player. I'll see you next time.